disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Corrine, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the December 10th, 2025 issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Thank you for joining us today. The highlights under Business and Finance are: the artificial intelligence chips that NVIDIA is allowed to ship to China will undergo a special security review in the U.S. before they are exported, administration officials said. Charlie Kirk's posthumously published book, Stop in the Name of God: Why Honoring the Sabbath Will Transform Your Life, sold out within hours on Amazon and was moving briskly at other outlets. BMW made Milan Nedeljkovic its next management board chairman, a role akin to CEO elsewhere, which he will assume after the company's annual meeting in May. A sharp drop in J.P. Morgan Chase shares helped depress the Dow by 0.4%, while the S&P 500 fell less than 0.1%, and the Nasdaq rose 0.1%. Silver hit a record powered by confidence that the Fed will cut interest rates this week in fears of a global supply squeeze. National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett said he wouldn't bow to political pressure to decide whether to cut interest rates if he becomes the next Fed chairman. CBS News hired Matt Gutman, a longtime ABC News journalist, as its chief correspondent, giving him a January start date and a Los Angeles base. ExxonMobil expects higher earnings and cash flow through the end of the decade, driven partly by a more profitable business mix. Campbell's said tariff-related price increases weighed on its soup business as sales and profit fell in the last quarter. Layoffs crept higher in recent months, but the job market remains steady since the summer, the Labor Department said in its monthly survey of job openings and labor turnover. CVS expects its turnaround efforts to pay off as it raised its full-year outlook and foresees that momentum carrying over into 2026. Now for the key articles under the Worldwide section. Trump dialed up pressure on Ukraine to swiftly accept a U.S.-designed peace plan, hardening his position toward Kyiv and its European backers, who insist U.S. security guarantees are vital to any deal. Trump touted the economy in a campaign rally-style speech in Pennsylvania and sought to blame Democrats on the affordability issue. Senate Majority Leader Thune said he would hold a vote later this week on a GOP measure aimed at controlling health care costs. Miami elected a Democrat as mayor for the first time in about 3 decades, as Eileen Higgins won decisively over a Trump-backed candidate. Russia and Chinese bombers flew near Japan and South Korea in a joint patrol that Tokyo described as a show of force. Honduras's Attorney General urged international authorities to arrest a former president on corruption charges days after Trump pardoned him. Israel's aggressive posture toward the new government in Syria emerged as a point of disagreement with Washington, where Trump wants a quick resolution to the two countries' decades-old tensions. A planned news conference by Venezuelan opposition leader and Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado was canceled a day before the award ceremony in Oslo. State senators in Indiana advanced a proposal to redraw the state's congressional boundaries, but it wasn't clear if it had the support to become law in a final vote. Nassau County Executive Bruce Blakeman said he is running for governor of New York, setting up a Republican primary battle with Representative Elise Stefanik, a Trump ally. The family of a black teen fatally shot by a San Diego police officer will receive $30 million after the city council approved the payment. A suspect was in custody after one person was killed and one injured in a shooting at Kentucky State University. A judge granted the Justice Department's request to publicly release grand jury transcripts and other material from Ghislaine Maxwell's sex trafficking case. A Bronx man was charged with attempted murder in the shooting of New York Jets player Chris Boyd. Died Raul Malo, 60, the Mavericks frontman. The picture on today's front page shows a line of tractor-like vehicles completely loaded with household goods in the back, traveling down a country road. And the caption reads, Exodus, a line of vehicles Tuesday in Adar Mingchi province, Cambodia, streams away from fighting along the disputed border with Thailand. Tens of thousands fled on both sides after a skirmish Sunday derailed a ceasefire in effect since July. And the headline, Civilians Flee Renewed Thai-Cambodian Fighting. The article, Senate Leader Vows to Fight Thailand. Cambodia's powerful Senate President Hun Sen on Tuesday vowed a fierce fight against Thailand as a second day of widespread renewed combat between the Southeast Asian neighbors drove tens of thousands of people to flee border areas. Fighting broke out following a skirmish on Sunday during which 2 Thai soldiers were injured, derailing a ceasefire that ended fighting over competing territorial claims in July. The 5 days of fighting then left dozens dead on both sides and forced the evacuation of over 100,000 civilians. Thai Prime Minister Anutin Chanvarakul on Tuesday said Cambodia hadn't contacted Thailand about possible negotiations and the fighting would continue. Trump's shift on NVIDIA chips bolsters China's AI ambitions. President lifted ban on sales soon after Justice Department filed smuggling case. By Stu Wu. Singapore. With one unorthodox deal, President Trump instantly reshaped the U.S.-China technological Cold War. The fear among his critics, he just helped Beijing catch up. By letting NVIDIA sell its H200 artificial intelligence chips to China, he gave the U.S. company the giant market it demanded. But he also handed China's AI industry what it couldn't build itself, the high-end semiconductors needed to rival the U.S. Until Monday, a political debate swirled around these chips. National security hawks argued they had to be withheld to stifle China's development of military weaponry and perhaps one day advanced AI systems that outfox humans. On the other side was NVIDIA with this counter-argument. Chinese cash fuels American innovation. Trump effectively settled the argument by siding with the world's most valuable company. We will protect national security, create American jobs, and keep America's lead in AI, he wrote on social media. While the mechanics of the deal remain fuzzy, Trump said Washington would collect 25% of NVIDIA's China sales without explaining how. The winners are clear. First is NVIDIA, the undisputed AI chip leader, which estimated it could ship up to $5 billion in orders to China every quarter without geopolitical constraints. The second is China itself. Its domestic chip makers make inferior products and not enough of them. One famous Chinese startup, DeepSeek, has already shown it can do surprising things with relatively few NVIDIA chips. It is clear Chinese buyers want these chips. A Justice Department case disclosed on Monday helps demonstrate that. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Houston announced that Operation Gatekeeper disrupted a network trying to smuggle at least $160 million of restricted artificial intelligence chips to China and elsewhere. Released in early 2024, the H200 is roughly one generation older than NVIDIA's newer Blackwell chips. To some national security hawks, that is still too powerful for China. Fed eyes rate cut, higher bar for next move. Powell aims to stitch together consensus over growing divisions. By Nick Timiraeus. When Federal Reserve officials gathered on Tuesday for their final two-day rate-setting meeting of the year, as much as half the room might have been against a cut. But the final call rests with Chair Jerome Powell, who appears poised to secure one despite the unusual opposition. The focus this week will be whether Powell can stitch together enough consensus to minimize dissents. That would likely happen by cutting interest rates a quarter point to a range of 3.5% to 3.75%, and then signaling a higher bar for further easing through changes to the post-meeting statement. This cut and cap approach would echo how Powell concluded a sequence of 3 rate cuts in 2019 that also divided the committee. Powell led his colleagues to cut in September and October after judging that the labor market looked shakier and the tariff-driven inflation surge that many feared hadn't materialized. That assessment would also underpin a decision to cut this week. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. OpenAI aims to correct course and fend off Google. CEO Altman is now prioritizing chatbot ChatGPT in a company that has been divided over its strategic goals. By Sam Schechner, Berber Jin, and Keach Hagee. When OpenAI CEO Sam Altman made the dramatic call for a code red last week to beat back a rising threat from Google, he put a notable priority on the top of his list of fixes. The world's most valuable startup should pause its side projects like its Sora video generator for 8 weeks and focus on improving ChatGPT, its popular chatbot that kicked off the AI boom. In so doing, Altman was making a major strategic course correction and taking sides in a broader philosophical divide inside the company between its pursuit of popularity among everyday consumers and its quest for research greatness. OpenAI was founded to pursue artificial general intelligence, broadly defined as being able to outthink humans at almost all tasks. But the company, to survive, Altman was suggesting it may have to pause that quest and give the people what they want. The move was striking in part because one criticism of Altman's leadership has been his reluctance to put limits on what the company can accomplish. And it was telling that he instructed employees to boost ChatGPT in a specific way through better use of user signals, he wrote in his memo. With that directive, Altman was calling for turning up the crank on a controversial source of training data, including signals based on one-click feedback from users, rather than evaluations from professionals of the chatbot's responses. An internal shift to rely on that user feedback had helped make ChatGPT's 4.0 model so sycophantic earlier this year that it had been accused of exacerbating severe mental health issues for some users. Now, Altman thinks the company has mitigated the worst aspects of that approach, but is poised to capture the upside. It significantly boosted engagement as measured by performance on internal dashboards tracking daily active users. Cracker Barrel staggers. The restaurant chain, which kicked off a furor this summer when it unveiled a new logo and now faces customer ire over the quality of its food, reported revenue of $797.2 million for the 3 months ended October 31st, compared with the $800 million expected by analysts. Trump pushes Kyiv to accept plan. Ukraine is losing the war and Russia holds the cards in talks, President said. By Lawrence Norman, Anastasia Malenko, and Alexander Ward. President Trump dialed up pressure on Ukraine to swiftly accept a U.S.-designed plan, hardening his position toward the embattled country and its European backers, who insist U.S. security guarantees are vital to a peace deal. Exacerbating tensions between Europe and Washington, Trump lambasted European leaders as weak and said Russia holds the cards in negotiations with Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is going to have to get on the ball and start accepting things, Trump said Monday in an interview with Politico, adding that Ukraine is losing. In a sign of Zelensky's willingness to accommodate Trump's demands, up to a point, the Ukrainian president said Tuesday that he is willing to hold long-delayed elections. Ukraine would need help to do so under continuous Russian attacks and ensure military participation in the vote, he said. Zelensky said Ukraine's parliament would have to approve legislation to allow elections during martial law. His 5-year term was set to end in 2024, but martial law declared after Russia's 2022 invasion bans election. Trump reiterated previous calls for elections in his Politico interview. It is an important time to hold an election, Trump said, acknowledging maybe Zelensky would win. On Tuesday, Zelensky said the talks with European governments and the U.S. are focused on a 20-point framework outlining the draft plan and a separate document on security guarantees for Kyiv. A third document describes plans for Ukraine's reconstruction. Changes to the 20-point plan recently worked out by European and Ukrainian officials likely will be shared with the U.S. on Wednesday, he said. He expected meetings with members of Trump's national security team to occur this week. Security guarantees are an important document between us and the United States of America, between us and the Europeans, Zelensky said. The Trump administration's initial peace proposal alarmed Ukraine and its closest European allies for offering concessions that were seen to heavily favor Russia. A U.S. official said 3 major sticking points include which territory Ukraine should surrender to Russia, whether Ukraine can ever join NATO, and how Russian assets currently frozen by Western Europe can be used to pay for Ukraine's reconstruction. Russian Chinese Fly Patrol near Japan by Jason Douglas, Tokyo. Russian and Chinese bombers flew near Japan and South Korea in a joint patrol Tuesday that Tokyo described as a show of force, adding further strain to the worst diplomatic crisis in years between Tokyo and Beijing. The military exercise, which Russian state media said lasted around 8 hours, comes amid a series of Chinese reprisals against Tokyo over remarks last month by Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Taikachi suggesting that Japan might be dragged into any conflict over Taiwan, the self-ruled island that Beijing claims as its own. The joint Chinese patrol with Russia follows another tense incident on Saturday, when Japan said Chinese warplanes locked radar on Japanese military aircraft near Okinawa, drawing protests from Tokyo and a rebuke from the U.S. China's actions are not conducive to regional peace and stability. a U.S. State Department spokesman said late Tuesday, referring to Saturday's confrontation. The U.S.-Japan alliance is stronger and more united than ever. Our commitment to our ally Japan is unwavering, and we are in close contact on this and other issues. Honduras seeks arrest of its former president by San Diego Perez and Juan Carlos Rivera. San Pedro Sula, Honduras. Honduras's Attorney General urged international authorities to arrest a former president on corruption charges, days after he walked out of a U.S. prison following a pardon by President Trump. Juan Orlando Hernandez was convicted in the U.S. last year of helping smuggle 400 tons of cocaine and was serving a 45-year prison term. He was released last week from a high-security prison in West Virginia after Trump's pardon. Honduran Attorney General Joel Antonio Zelaya asked Interpol, the global police organization, to execute an arrest warrant for Hernandez issued in late 2023 for fraud and money laundering. We have been lacerated by the tentacles of corruption and by criminal networks that have profoundly marked the life of our country, Zelaya wrote on X on Monday. He included a photo of the arrest warrant issued in case Hernandez were to be released by U.S. authorities after his extradition in 2022. While Hernandez can't be charged with the same offenses for which he was tried and pardoned in the U.S., the arrest warrant is linked to the diversion of public funds into political campaigns conducted over a decade ago, a spokesman for Zelaya said. U.S. Israel differ on Syria by Dov Lieber, Tel Aviv. Israel's aggressive posture toward the new government in Syria has emerged as a rare point of disagreement with Washington, where President Trump wants a quick resolution to the two countries' decades-old tensions. After the collapse of Bashar al-Assad's regime a year ago, Israel carved out a 155-square-mile area inside Syria that it still holds. Since then, it has carried out arrests, seized weapons, and conducted frequent airstrikes in the south of the country. During the summer, Israel struck Syria's military headquarters in Damascus in what it said was an effort to defend the Druze minority, with strong ties to Israel, from sectarian attacks. Trump, urged by Middle Eastern allies including Saudi Arabia and Turkey, has lifted sanctions on new Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara. He has praised the former jihadist as doing a good job. Discord between Israel and Syria has been a point of frustration for Washington, which generally has supported Israel in its wars with Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. The U.S. is brokering talks on a security pact between Syria and Israel that could lay the groundwork for a long-term peace, but they appear stalled. Trump is calling on Israel to do that deal. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu contends that such an agreement is possible only if Syria accepts the demilitarization of land stretching from southern Damascus to the Israeli border, a demand rejected by Shara, who says it would create a security vacuum in southern Syria. Israel took a lesson from the deadly October 7th, 2023 Hamas attacks from Gaza that it can't bargain away its security interests to please its neighbors or even Washington. It sees U.S.-supported withdrawals from Gaza in 2005 and southern Lebanon in 2000 as mistakes that allowed Hamas and Hezbollah to prepare launch pads for cross-border attacks. It's easy to take the risk when you're in Washington, but when you're in the Golan Heights, it's much more risky, said a former Israeli national security advisor. Trump hasn't openly criticized Israel for its Syria policy, but has made clear what he wants. It is very important that Israel maintain a strong and true dialogue with Syria, he wrote on Truth Social, and that nothing takes place that will interfere with Syria's evolution into a prosperous state. The diverging views over the new Syria demonstrate the risks run by Israel's military posture since the October 7th attacks. The Israeli security establishment blames Israel's inability to foresee the Hamas-led attacks on the country's failure to thwart threats along its border. It allowed Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon to build up, believing they would never burst across the border en masse. Since reaching a truce with Hezbollah in November 2024, Israel has kept a military presence inside Lebanon near its border and has carried out near daily airstrikes, it says, are aimed at foiling attempts by the Lebanese militia to rearm. But even in Israel, some former generals and security experts worry that Netanyahu is overreaching in regard to Syria, threatening Israel's relationship with its most important ally, and creating an image more broadly as a regional belligerent. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the editorial page, a climate study retraction for the ages. A much hyped study in Nature turns out to have been full of errors. One scandal of our age is the attempt to sell the public on the narrative of climate catastrophe. It's been fed by the press and overheated political and scientific claims that sometimes are phony. That's the story with the journal Nature's retraction of a highly publicized climate study that made headlines. The study was a shocker when it was first published in April 2024. Scientists at Germany's Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research projected that climate change could cost $38 trillion in economic damage a year by 2049. To put that number in perspective, the GDP of North America last year was about $31.4 trillion. The study's finding would mean that storms, heat waves, and other calamities supposedly caused by climate change would wipe out the equivalent of the North American economy and then some every year. The study also forecast that rising carbon dioxide emissions would cause a 62% reduction in global GDP by 2100, and that damage over the next quarter of a century would exceed the cost of mitigating global warming by 6 times. Progressives hyped the study to argue that government interventions like electric vehicle mandates, are worth the cost. The study shines a light on the patterns and severity of climate change's economic impacts while bolstering key conclusions from other research, reported Axios, a leading promoter of the climate scare narrative. Yet, not long after the study was published, other scientists flagged problems with its methodology and errors in its data. In July 2024, Nature issued a correction noting that rows of data were wrongly printed as a decimal rather than a percentage point. Other scientists wrote in a comment to Nature, akin to a newspaper letter to the editor, that the study underestimates uncertainty, rendering the results statistically insignificant when properly corrected. Still, other scientists in August noted in a comment that data anomalies arising from one country in the underlying GDP dataset, Uzbekistan, substantially biased their predicted impacts of climate change. When the Uzbekistan data was removed and statistical uncertainty corrected for, the results were no longer statistically distinguishable from migration cost at any time this century. In other words, the economic harm from climate change no longer exceeded the cost of the government interventions to do something to arrest warming temperatures. The study had so many errors that Nature has now retracted it. But what an embarrassment. Post-publication, the results were found to be sensitive to the removal of one country, Uzbekistan, where inaccuracies were noted in the underlying economic data for the period 1995 to 1999, the retraction says. The retraction is also a black eye for the Network for Greening the Financial System, a group of central banks and financial regulators that incorporated the study's projections into its bank climate stress test scenarios. The Federal Reserve belonged to the network until Chair Jerome Powell withdrew in January. One question is why the study's glaring errors weren't caught by peer reviewers before it was published. One culprit might be conformity bias, as reviewers didn't want to gainsay findings that support the narrative that humanity is killing the planet and the entire world economy must be rearranged to prevent it. When politics is in the saddle, the chances of bad science increase. If progressives want to know why so many Americans don't believe claims of the climate apocalypse, it's because so much of climate science has been shown to be unbelievable. Potheads head for the ER. 2 new studies show that the ill effects of THC are increasing. Here's some surprising political news. A referendum campaign is gaining support in Massachusetts, of all places, to reverse the state's 2016 legalization of recreational marijuana. Not coincidentally, 2 new studies report a surge in young pot users showing up at hospital emergency rooms. Doctors at Mass General Brigham Hospital found that the share of adolescents with psychiatric emergencies who tested positive for THC, the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana, jumped nearly 4-fold after the drug was legalized for recreational sale and consumption in the state. The prevalence of other cannabis-related disorders among adolescents increased by a similar amount. Young people with mental health challenges are more vulnerable to the negative effects of cannabis use, which can catalyze or worsen psychiatric symptoms, author Cheryl Yun-Shi Fu writes. She adds that legalization of the drug can lead to greater accessibility, social acceptability, and advertising that increases use among young people. The last point is common sense. Legalization removes a stigma from marijuana use as well as increasing its availability. Meantime, a new study in the Journal of American Medical Association, JAMA, finds a surge in young adults nationwide showing up at hospital emergency rooms with cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, CHS. This is a cyclical vomiting, often with nausea or stomach pain, that is far more severe than what someone might experience after a night of binge drinking. It is caused by heavy marijuana use, especially at high potencies. ER visits for the disorder increased nearly eightfold in the spring of 2020 as COVID lockdowns took hold. Visits dropped some in 2022, but remained about 5 times higher than before the pandemic. The U.S. Northeast and West experienced the biggest spikes, perhaps not surprising, since most states in those regions have legalized marijuana and they also impose strict lockdowns. California, New York, and other progressive states allowed pot dispensaries to stay open during the lockdowns by deeming them essential businesses. Instead of working, young people got high at home. The study notes that better awareness among physicians of the disorder may contribute to the increase in ER diagnoses. An earlier study found that patients with the syndrome visited the ER on average 18 times before getting diagnosed, costing on average $76,920 per patient. Maybe someone can investigate how much Medicaid is spending on treating pothead maladies. An accompanying commentary in JAMA says that stopping marijuana use is the cornerstone of preventing the syndrome, but abrupt discontinuation may lead to withdrawal and high rates of relapse. Legalization proponents downplay marijuana's negative effects and addictive potential, but daily marijuana use is more common than daily alcohol use, according to a Carnegie Mellon University analysis last year of national survey data. A group in Massachusetts last week submitted more than 74,000 signatures for a ballot referendum next November to reverse the state's legalization experiment. These days, this is a counterculture cause, but it's one that may gain momentum as the ills of pothead culture, and especially from pot use among the young, become more widespread. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the opinion pages, The Economics of Immigration by Roland Fryer. Donald Trump vowed to launch the largest deportation operation in American history, and he has been dispatching federal agents into cities across the country to carry it out. The initiative is marketed primarily as a crime control strategy, a dramatic show of force meant to signal the return of law and order, but also as a way to protect American workers from job competition. The logic sounds straightforward. Remove undocumented immigrants, and crime will fall as native wages rise. Economics tells a different story. Immigration is among the most rigorously studied topics in the field, and decades of evidence contradict the premise that undocumented immigrants drive crime or meaningfully suppress native wages. Immigrants, especially those here illegally, are less likely to commit crimes than native-born Americans. Meanwhile, the economic and social cost of mass deportation will extend far beyond the billions of dollars required to carry it out. The policy will hollow out key industries, erode trust in public institutions, and weaken the public safety it purports to restore. The real debate, then, isn't about crime or immigration per se. It is about integration and the incentive structures our policies create. The question is whether we build a system that encourages immigrants to become productive, law-abiding contributors while credibly deterring unlawful entry, or a system that marginalizes millions and then feigns surprise when predictable failures follow. This tension has long defined immigration policy and research. In the 1990s and 2000, George Borges and David Card staged one of era's most influential debates. Does low-skilled immigration harm native workers? Mr. Borges argued that it depresses wages for comparable natives. Mr. Card countered with natural experiments, most famously the 1980 Mariel boat lift, showing negligible effects on native employment or earnings. Labor markets, Mr. Card found, are far more dynamic than critics assume. Immigrants increase labor supply, but also generate new demand. It was a modern confirmation of Say's law. Economies grow when the number of people, not only of jobs, does. Hundreds of studies followed. The broad consensus today is that immigration has had very small impacts on wage inequality of natives, as Mr. Card, a 2021 Nobel laureate, put it in his 2009 Eli Lecture to the American Economic Association. When wage effects do exist, they fall more on earlier immigrants than on native workers. Crucially, even these modest effects depend on how well newcomers are integrated into the economy. That last point applies equally to crime. Mr. Trump frames his policy in terms of public safety and paychecks, but the underlying mistake is identical. Immigrants are treated as a static shock rather than as people who adapt to and are shaped by the incentives around them. Gary Becker's 1968 classic paper, Crime and Punishment, An Economic Approach, revolutionized our understanding of crime by treating it as a rational response to expected costs and benefits. For immigrants, the opportunity cost of crime rises with access to decent jobs, education, legal protections, and social networks. When those pathways exist, crime becomes irrational. But if we criminalize their daily existence, deny legal work, and threaten deportation, we lower those opportunity costs, perversely making crime more appealing. Deportation is not only morally fraught and fiscally extravagant, it undercuts the very mechanisms that deter crime in the first place. Critics worry that integration or legalization will encourage more unlawful entry. That concern is legitimate. Migration responds to wage differences and the perceived probability of eventual incorporation. If legalization is guaranteed, flows increase. Where enforcement is credible, flows decline. The U.S. has always wrestled with this trade-off. The lesson isn't that we must choose between open borders and mass deportation. Both are costly extremes that ignore human incentives. The economic sweet spot is credible enforcement of entry rules paired with serious integration for those already here. Enforcement deters unlawful entry. Integration maximizes contribution and raises the opportunity cost of crime. This is how you capture the benefits of immigration while minimizing its risks. The evidence supports this approach. Programs that move undocumented immigrants closer to legal status reduce criminal behavior and increase employment, education, and civic participation. That isn't because people are scared straight, but because the stakes of failure rise and the avenues for success widened. A 2018 criminology paper found that undocumented immigration has no effect on violent crime and may reduce certain offenses. A meta-analysis in the Annual Review of Criminology reached the same conclusion. Higher immigrant concentrations aren't associated with more crime and are often linked with less. President Trump's plan ignores this evidence while imposing tens of billions of dollars in cost on industries from agriculture to hospitality, all to solve a problem the data suggests is largely imaginary. The larger danger is symbolic. Mass deportation communicates that millions of immigrants are permanently outside the circle of belonging. That message is economically corrosive. When people believe they are excluded, no matter what they do, the incentive to follow rules collapses. Social exclusion isn't merely a moral failure, it destroys the very mechanisms that encourage lawful, productive behavior. What we need is a pragmatic policy of integration, not amnesty, not open borders, but targeted investments in language acquisition, credential recognition, housing, and education paired with credible border enforcement. This is the incentive-compatible framework that has historically allowed immigrants to thrive and in turn strengthen the nation. And if the debate isn't really about wages or crime, what is driving the anxiety? Research by Mr. Card, Christian Dussman, and Ian Preston provides an uncomfortable answer. Attitudes toward immigration are shaped far more by compositional concerns, meaning changes in the cultural and social makeup of communities, than by labor market effects. In their estimates using European data, these concerns are 2 to 5 times as important as traditional economic factors. Resistance to immigration reflects not labor market fears, but unease with cultural change. Deportation may appear in a narrow sense, to solve compositional discomfort, but only by choosing the most economically costly and socially destructive approach. Ignoring these underlying preferences guarantees policy failure. The history of American immigration is a series of experiments in integrating newcomers into shared prosperity. When we get integration right, immigrants flourish and the country grows stronger. Deportation misunderstands every major incentive at work. It overstates the wage threat, misapplies the economics of crime, and treats cultural anxiety as a problem that can be eliminated by removing people rather than managing change. Open borders make a parallel mistake in the opposite direction. The economic reality is that labor markets adapt, crime responds to incentives, and cultural concerns must be addressed rather than wished away. When we treat immigrants as future citizens rather than permanent outsiders, while credibly enforcing our border rules, we build safer communities, stronger labor markets, and a country confident enough to turn newcomers into contributors. Mr. Fryer, a journal contributor, is a professor of economics at Harvard, a founder of Equal Opportunity Ventures, and a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. The Pepper and Salt cartoon shows a man and woman walking down a business corridor, and the man says, "I've been doing this job too long to be persuaded by logic and reason." You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the December 10th, 2025 issue of the Wall Street Journal. We read from the Wall Street Journal every Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m. Your reader has been Corrine. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day or evening. And stay warm.
If you or people you know shop at any of the Dash's supermarkets, please save Dash's register tapes for radio reading. Our agency receives $2 for every $100 in Dash's register tapes. Radio reading has raised thousands of dollars so far. Anyone can drop off their Dash's tapes to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service at 1199 Harlem Road, Cheektowaga, between William and Clinton Streets. Or Dash's tapes can be mailed to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service at 1199 Harlem Road, Cheektowaga, New York, 14227. Any questions on Dash's tapes for radio reading? Call us at 716-821-5555, and thanks for caring.